The Eye of Argon is one of the most notorious works of sword and sorcery ever released. Once cited as the apotheosis of bad writing, it was published in 1970 by the 16-year-old Jim Theis, and single-handedly terminated a passion that had yet to flourish. It was published in OSFAN number 10, which was discontinued in around 1971, a fanzine born from a science fiction society out in the Ozarks. The Eye of Argon might be a familiar name to those who trawl science fiction forums, though nowadays its unique qualities have cast the name out into the internet at large. It led its author, Jim Theis, to infamy as a McGonagall-like figure and a master of solecism. The work is replete with typos and grammatical errors, though whether or not these are the fault of our author is up for debate and something we'll look into. You'll see these issues when I quote the text verbatim here and there throughout the video, including keeping the typos, weird agrammaticisms, and non-words. But before I continue, please note that this video is not made in an attempt to crucify the work of a dead man, nor the man himself, but exists instead to shine an investigatorial eye on this bizarre niche story, both within the text and beyond. So while there will be instances where we can laugh together at the novella, it shan't be at the expense of Theis. My intent is not to beat a dead horse. One work shouldn't be used to judge the integrity of the character who wrote it, and beyond that, Jim Theis did something most don't have the courage to do, to submit a creative work into the public eye. Nevertheless, it is important to look at everything with compassionate curiosity and a critical mindset, principles that must extend to works even considered bad. I'll conclude this point for now, though I have a lot to say on it. I do want to spend some time discussing the Eye of Argon, doing my best to summarize the plot, decode the weirdness, and break it down. It won't be easy, mind you, this text is challenging. I truly suggest that you seek it out. My rendition will do no justice. Our story begins with a fiery, red-haired Conan-style barbarian named Grignr, set in the heart of the Norgolian Empire. As an aside, Theis was a big fan of Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan the Barbarian, and the father of sword and sorcery. The novella opens with Grignr in the midst of a battle with some soldiers, military men sicked on him because he fornicated with a faithless concubine from the Cimmerian city of Grignr. I believe the intended language is Sumerian, but it is really quite hard to tell. They're defeated swiftly enough, these mercenaries. Grignr is a right and proper warrior. Our boy has a bounty on his head and wild blood coursing through his savage veins. He really, really wants to get freaky with some wenches, and fortunately for him, his next stop, Gorzam, has those aplenty. Aside from some minor spelling errors and agrammaticisms, this chapter is quite effective. Though rather verbose for my tastes, it does communicate a solid amount of information. We're shown our setting, the genre, and given some characterization in seeing the way that Grignr fights. I'd shift the paragraphs around a bit, or work some into others altogether were I editing it, but the scaffolding is there. It isn't great, far from it, but I've seen worse, and certainly read far less entertaining. Chapter 2 is considerably longer, and it opens with Grignr making his way into a seedy tavern in Gorzam. Men of ill repute are noted to be tossing dice, gambling, or making love to willing escorts. Quite progressive, Theis. Our lead sees a lone female and moves towards her, wishing to wholesomely occupy his time. We're presented shortly with our next physical description of Grignr, and to save on seconds, he looks like a red-headed, shirtless Dovahkiin. Grignr and this presently unnamed woman engage in willing acts of love and passion before the party is crashed by some soldiers. I can't really decode why Theis is emphasizing the willingness of passion here, other than maybe some religious affiliations that I can't find anything about. A fight ensues, words that we shouldn't use to refer to women anymore are used, and Grignr unalives a dude. The aforementioned shan't be named is synonymous with harlot and rhymes with nut. It will heretofore be substituted out for promiscuous boy. We'll discuss its use a bit more later on in a more academic context, as it likely isn't intended to mean what one might think on first reading. Things seem to be going rather well before that soldier's friends jump in, and for whatever reason Grignr decides to taunt, and then sheath his sword. This taunt to get bodied combo is met with steel in his face and a loss, as Grignr yields and surrenders. He's paraded around town for a bit before being brought in front of a stocky man on a golden throne, unfortunately not the God Emperor. We'll come to learn in about 2 chapters that this is Agaphim, a prince. They exchange some generic dialogue, the like you'd expect to see between a rebellious man and a sovereign noble. You know the kind. On your knees, nay, how dare you? But then Grignr drops the hardest down with the rich bomb of all time. I find you to be the only fool sitting upon your pompous throne, enhancing the rolling flabs of your belly in the midst of your elaborate luxury end. I don't exactly know what a luxury end is, but it sounds kinda hard. I assume the intended spelling was luxury yard. This earns Grignr a warranted banishment to the Vault of Misery, as he is made to await death. However, before he is sent to the Vault of Misery, the nobleman's advisor, Agaphim, suggests that Grignr instead be banished to a life spent in the confinement of the Stygian pits. Grignr is not pleased. He is a self-reported man of the wilds, and a life in the confines of a dungeon would be immeasurably worse than death. We're then to read a bizarre exchange of words, which I'll just quote directly from the following paragraphs. I shall never understand the ways if your twisted civilization, and am condemned to life confinement by a pig who sits on his royal ass wooing whores and knows nothing of the affairs of the land he imagines to rule, lectures Grignr. Enough of this. Away with the promiscuous boy before I loose my control. Grignr then musters up the courage to be a badass barbarian and unalives the guard, stabs the advisor Agaphim through the ribs, and then taunts, again, before getting bodied, again, by some unknown defender of our noble. So, our nobleman prince is referring to Grignr as a harlot rhymes with nut, a woman with many casual sexual partners, according to Oxford. That's quite interesting to our modern sensibilities, given the way we use the word nowadays. But words change meaning. In the 14th century Canterbury Tales, Chaucer writes, Why is thy lord so promiscuous boy, I thee pray, and is of power better cloth to bay, if that his deed accord with thy speech? So it's not being used sexually, and instead in reference to his unlordly appearance in the yeoman's tale, one unbefitting of his status. I have to imagine that it's being used to refer to individuals of perceived low moral fiber. Might be that Theis got out of English period 2 having just read the canon yeoman's tale, and thought that the use of the word was cool or interesting. So this might be the way Theis is choosing to use that word, though it's impossible to know for certain. I bring this up only because Theis often gets flack for the way that he uses some of his words, though it's entirely possible he's pulling from a source that the criticizer doesn't know about. So I just wanted to clear that up. Plus I found it quite interesting. Blackness overtakes us until Chapter 3 sees it fit to restore Grignr to consciousness. His head hurty, and we're given the pleasure of reading some really cool prose, like, to the shadowed land beyond the aperture of the grave, and this was indeed one of the buried chasms of hell concealed within the inner depths of the palace's despised interior, a fearful ebony chamber devised to drive to the brinks of insanity the minds of the unfortunately condemned through the inapt solitude of a limbo of listless, dreary silence. While these might not be great, and they certainly have their flaws, I really do believe that there's potential here, and some innovative prose coming from the mind of a 16-year-old. Anyway, that's Chapter 3, short and sweet. On to Chapter 3.5. This chapter is big. Not long, but big. We're set into some weird, twisted underground cathedral with an absolutely over-described altar. I'll save you the description. All of what you need to know is that it looks evil, and that there's a mallet that would definitely give like a +7 bonus to shadow damage. Encircling the altar is a whole troop of shadow wizards casting spells and making enough money to fund this very ornate endeavor. These guys are totally iced out. Gold earrings, satin robes, silvered silk sashes with ebony buckles in the shape of a skull, probably another +3 bonus to shadow damage, and felt slippers with golden spikes. They're absolutely iced, and praying to a giant jade idol. There's a naked woman with huge outcropping breasts, and an exquisitely molded body laying bare before the idol, a sure-to-be sacrifice. Then we're exposed Sauron style to the Eye of Argon, an Indiana Jones-like world-conquering artifact. It's a gem, but goddamn is it a really cool gem, and apparently very expensive. This chapter is awesome. Not for entirely good reasons, but man does it bring me back to those mildew-covered, brownie-smelling 70s sci-fi novels I used to rent from the library. It's super classic, and reminiscent even of the genre it's invoking. I think you could get more with less, but I'd argue it's one of, if not the most effectively written chapters in the entirety of the Eye of Argon. Certainly very efficient. This next chapter, Chapter 4, brings us right back to our boy Grignr. He's been in the Stygian pits for a while now. Maybe. He doesn't really know, he's not kept track of the days. He gets fed by the guards some disgusting, tainted slop. Things aren't looking good. Fret not though, Grignr's been scheming. We don't learn about his schemes, but he has been scheming, he says as much. But then, just as he's reflecting on his plots and thoughts, he's assaulted by a rat. It's the first time we've seen him experience fear. He throws himself back onto his butt as he covers his face. So, either Grignr has a fear of rats, or this is some excellently done, plot-derived characterization. He has, after all, been in the Stygian pits for an undisclosed amount of time, and his sanity certainly wanes, making a monster of shadows on the wall. What follows is a rather brutal scene, whereby he beats the rat in a 1v1, contemplates his existence, and realizes that he's really, really muscular. Yet he was still alive. His bulging sinews at the peak of marvel, his struggling mind floating in a myrill of impressed excellence of thought. This myrill of impressed excellence leads to a new conniving scheme. Worth noting that myrill isn't a word. I think the intended language was mire, like a swamp. So he's got this new scheme, and it's a scheme that he's willing to die for. The lever to freedom lies in the corpse of this rat. There's this wonderfully unguarded phrasing at the end of the paragraph which I wanted to showcase. Groping his way along the rough floor, Grignr finally found his tool in a pool of concealed gore. The carcass of the decapitated rodent. The tool that the very filth he had been sentenced to spawns. While over-punctuated and a touch laden with words, I'm a big fan of what Theis is aiming for here. Suffering bringing to its captors the tool for freedom. I would get rid of the entire middle section, or have written, groping along the rough floor, Grignr found his tool in the carcass of the rodent. But nevertheless, I think this sentence shows promise, and could definitely have been salvaged by working with a solid editor. Chapter 5 brings us right back to the woman prisoner within the mausoleum. One of the iced-out cultists grabs her, smiles at her, and heaves some disgusting, fetid breath right into her face. She kicks him in the balls, understandably. Cocking her right foot backwards, she leashed it desperately outwards with the strength of a demon possessed. lodging her sandaled foot squarely beneath the shaman's testicles. This absolute beauty of a sentence is followed by his face flushed to a rose-red shade of crimson, eyelids fluttering wide with eyeballs protruding blindly outward from their sockets to their outmost perimeters, while his lips quivered wildly about, allowing an agonized wallow to gust forth as his breath billowed from burning lungs. His hands reached out, clutching his urinary gland, as his knees wobbled rapidly about for a few seconds, then buckled, causing the ruptured shaman to collapse in an egg-huddled mass to the granite pavement, rolling helplessly about in his agony. That prompts the rest of the cultist priests to cover her head and put her to a sleep where she lapsed beneath a protective sheet of unconsciousness to a land peach and resign. This is an extraordinarily strong sentence in the context of the Eye of Argon, though I do believe it supersedes the bonds of its work into something rather special. Peach and resign is such a clever means by which to affirm her falling asleep that it's hard for me not to appreciate it and find that it elevates the chapter to something beyond a simple, haha funny she kicks him in the balls gag. I recommend you invest in Peach and resign. I promise you it's really, really strong. Chapter 6 is quite long, easily the longest and most important chapter in the text, insofar as the plot is concerned. It opens with Grignr once again being called a promiscuous boy by two guards that offer him a rope so that he can climb out of his cell and into an even deeper hellhole. We get a brief description of Grignr again, with the standout being a mention of the small opaque object beneath the folds of the G-string wrapped around his waist. I really don't know why Grignr is wearing a G-string. I understand that this is more referential to a loincloth than anything, but I'm sure he looks fabulous. Slay, king. The guards are equally fabulous, with a bunch of purple satin. They're wearing copper morions, satin girdles, hauberks, and scratch all that. They look like the guards from Jesus Christ Superstar. They apprehend Grignr, but before they can tie his hands behind his back, he unalives one of them with that aforementioned opaque object, the tediously honed pelvis bone of the broken rodent. The second guard swings his axe at the barbarian, but gets nothing more than shavings of hair. The axe instead gets stuck inside his companion's body. He can't get it up in time, I feel you. So Grignr unalives him too, but not before the sentry plunged his right fist into Grignr's face, digging his grimy nails into the barbarian's flesh. Ejaculating a curse through rasping breath, Grignr surged the bulk of his weight forward, bowling the besieged soldier over upon his back. Grignr, after finding freedom from his Stygian prison, takes to snorting a gusty billow of mirth. He equips the soldier's garb and sets forth into the dungeon so he can find his way out of the dungeons. Plus, he's coming up on 100 sneak, so he makes his way past a patrol and finds his way into a storeroom. Being the helpless little goblin that he is, Grignr goes to check for valuables and triggers a trap. Thankfully, he has keen auditory organs and lightning-steeled reflex, because if he didn't, Grignr would have been groping through the shadowed hell pits of the Grim Reaper. Some kind of miniature catapult nearly skewered him, and choosing caution, he decides to forego further looting and instead descends through a newly formed gap in the floor to a deeper floor of this dungeon, the palace's mausoleum. Suddenly, a scream. Grignr immediately thinks to himself that it might be a ghost. He, like other barbarians, he thinks, is superstitious. He can kill any corporeal foe, but the incorporeal is a different matter altogether. Another scream that he places as coming from within one of the sarcophagi erupts. And this time he's convinced there's some human component. Our brave hero opens the tomb and finds nothing living. Just human embalmed and rotting. As it turns out, he also has keen visual organs since he notices that there's a false door beneath the mummy, where he realizes the cries are coming from. Imagine, since the scene is quite chaotically written here, that he's overlooking these priests, the idol of Argon from earlier, and the woman from chapters previous. We have the absolute privilege of seeing that +7 shadow damage mallet again, being held by the head priest, who's leading a big multi-cultist ordeal as they all stand around the amorphous, broad-breasted female stretched out alluringly before his gaping eyes. Grignr jumps down and unleashes a terrifying battle cry that actually causes one of the priests to become a victim of an epileptic seizure. That's an absolutely terrifying skill to have. Fortunately, the rest of the priests succeed on their saving throws and don't become victims of epileptic seizures, but they instead fall easy prey to Grignr's sweeping arc of crimsoned death and maiming destruction. Silence overtakes the mausoleum as Grignr, gremlin as always, turns his attention first to the giant jade idol, which is much too large for him to take, so instead he yoinks the Eye of Argon. Then the woman has to remind him that she's right there. Side note, the Eye of Argon is described as being a red emerald, and I've found some discourse online about how that's a dumb fantasy gem or whatever, but red emeralds are real. Just Google red beryl. I'm not saying that Theis knew of red beryl's existence, but I thought this is a good time to insert a bit of a fun fact. That aside, let's pick up with the next paragraph. "You," ejaculated the accordion in a pleased tone. "I thought that I had seen the last of you at the tavern, but verily I was mistaken." I'd like to move on, verily. He frees her, and the two continue out of the chamber. We are delivered some character/world building, because the two have some dialogue where we learn that she was a slave of Prince Agaphim before escaping by seducing a guard whom she then killed, which she states whimsically. There's some legendary dialogue here that's worth reading verbatim. Carthena, daughter of Mincardos, Duke of Barwego, whose lands border along the northwestern fringes of Gorzam. I was paid as homage to Agaphim upon his 38th year, husked the femme. "And I am called a barbarian," grunted Grignr in a disgusted tone. "Aye, the ways of our civilization are in many ways warped and distorted. But what is your calling?" she queried, bustily. Bustily, eh? Okay, Theis, I get you. Chapter 6 reaches its end with us learning that Carthena was actually found by Agaphim, imprisoned, and then captured by those crazed cultists from earlier. We learn that Agaphim worships some deity named Sargon, and that those cultists were actually members of his high court, so things wouldn't have ended well if he found out. There's a word Carthena uses that I really can't parse out. Skaztik? If you have any guesses on what that could be, from typo to actual word, please let me know, I'm really curious. The chapter then closes with Grignr using the speed of thought to swivel around in the face of a maddened, bloodlusting screech behind him. The 7th chapter is somewhat jarring. It's a transition into the mind and body of the priest afflicted by Grignr's epileptic seizures move. He's very angry that the Eye of Argon has been stolen and seeks vengeance upon Grignr. Though very short, only spanning 2 paragraphs, this chapter has one rather highlightable line. Above his head rose the hideous idol, its empty socket holding the shaman's eye-furbished, infuriated gaze. I don't know what eye-furbished means here, but everything else works rather well. The fire burning behind the eyes of the priest takes the place of the prismatic red emerald which has gone missing from the giant jade idol. The next half a chapter is somewhat confusing. See, chapter 6 ended with, seemingly utilizing the speed of thought, Grignr swiveled to face his unknown foe. With gaping eyes and widened jaws, Grignr raised his axe above his surly mane, but he was too late. He's too late, right? I mean, that's what it says, so this priest is gonna hit him, right? Well, the priest just kind of perishes. I can't discern if he's felled by the hand of Grignr, maybe backstabbed by Carthena, or just fate. Theis, maybe? Perhaps there's a Fist of the North Star style you're already dead thing going on with Grignr's epileptic seizures shout move. With that behind us, we can look forward to Grignr and Carthena discussing the nature of feudal society, the impetus of degenerated rulers, and the shackles of finance and threat that bind the citizenry to them. All the while, Carthena is leading the duo out of the dungeon, though in short order, the two stumble across Agafim and Agafind. Another note, pick distinct names for important characters. It'll make your work easier to discuss amongst fans or critics, and has the downstream upside of injecting some uniqueness into each character. Honestly, I was surprised to see that Agafind lived through his rib stabbing, but nevertheless they're participating in some generic villain dialogue, the last villainous duologue they'll ever participate in, since Grignr unalives Agafind and Carthena absolutely slays Agafim. Our guys escape from the dungeon through a cave opening and bear witness to a beautiful sunrise. A ball of feral red was rising through the mists of the eastern horizon, dissipating the slinking shadows of the night. Grignr wants to flex, so he draws the Eye of Argon and presents it right in front of the sun and says, "We shall do well with bauble." There's a missing demonstrative pronoun here, but more than that, it implies the continuation of an adventure. Unfortunately, the gemstone dribbled through Grignr's fingers in a slimy red ooze. The droplets of slime slowly converged into a pulsating, jelly-like mass. A single opening transfixed the blob, forming into a leech-like maw. An ooze. Does this qualify as intangible? Is Grignr afraid? The ooze is also giving him a bit of a nasty sucking, draining him of his life force and engaging in a vampiric feast. Carthena faints, and he's losing consciousness quickly. But in a fit of barbaric intelligence, Grignr plunges his torch into the slime, defeating it. Well, maybe. See, in the meta lore of the Eye of Argon, this is where the story ended for a long time, for a lot of people. At least up until 2005, when the New York Review of Science Fiction uncovered a complete, undefiled copy of OSFAN number 10 in the special collections of the Jack Williamson Science Fiction Library of Eastern New Mexico University, by a very special Gene Bundy, the Special Collections librarian. That uncovering brought us this, the legendary ending to the Eye of Argon. With a sloshing plop, the thing fell to the ground, evaporating in a thick scarlet cloud until it re-attained its original size. It remained thus for a moment as the puckered maw took the shape of a protruding red eyeball, the pupil of which seemed to unravel before it the tale of creation. How a shapeless mass slithered from the quagmires of the stigmatic pool of time, only to degenerate into a leprosy of avaricious lust. In that fleeting moment, the grim mystery of life was revealed before Grignr's ensnared gaze. The eyeball's glare turned to a sudden plea of mercy, a plea for the whole of humanity. Then the blob began to quiver with violent convulsions. The eyeball shattered into 1,000 tiny fragments and evaporated in a curling wisp of scarlet mist. The very ground below the thing began to vibrate and swallow it up with a belch. The thing gone forever, all that remained was a dark red blotch upon the face of the earth, blotching things up. Shaking his head, his shaggy mane to clear the jumbled fragments of his mind, Grignr tossed the limp female over his shoulder. Mounting one of the disgruntled mares and leading the other, the weary, scarred barbarian truded off slowly into the horizon to become a tiny pinpoint in a filtered field of swirling blue mists, leaving the nobles, soldiers, and peasants to replace the missing monarch. Long live the king! I really truly recommend you go and read The Eye of Argon yourself. It's not long, but even in all its brevity, it is memorable. I know that was a lot. I'm not keen on summary, and do prefer analysis, but in doing research for this video, found that there was a lack of analysis and of summary. Check the Wikipedia page for The Eye of Argon, and you'll find that the plot section gives each chapter a paragraph at best, and a sentence at worst. For such an important piece of literature, this struck me as quite bizarre and worth rectifying. I figure it comes out as a result of the piece being more often mocked than summated. So before we delve into the analysis, I want to remind each listener that Jim Theis was 16 when he wrote this. 16 in 1970, he couldn't exactly Google up a dictionary or a thesaurus. I'm not claiming that the work is good for a 16-year-old, nor am I saying that it's bad for a 16-year-old, just that it is a work published by a 16-year-old in an era where the personal computer was in its earliest stages. It doesn't surprise me to find that a youth during the 70s would write in this way because H.P. Lovecraft was probably the best thesaurus one could easily find. While it doesn't take much investigation to find countless instances of Theis hate on the internet, you also mustn't go very far to find equally staunch defenders of him either. This is a particularly new sensibility, and I do find it valid, frankly. It comes out of the camp of individuals who find putting yourself out there to be a brave act, which, granted, I believe has only become more true as the anonymity of social media makes compassionate critique a thing of the past. One notable critique of Theis as a writer is his poor spelling and agrammaticisms. While this may be true, I've found that OSFAN, the zine mentioned earlier, has a number of editing issues. More than that, however, in OSFAN number 13, an interview was conducted between Diamond Jim Theis and OSFAN, of which I'll read most as written. I'll link the PDF in the description below in case you want to read the full-length interview, though I'm going over most of it here in the video. The interviewer asks, "What did you think of your story, Eye of Argon, in OSFAN 10? Theis responds, "I admit I did make a few mistakes, but then I'm just a 16 years old. The editing that was done did not help it. In the future, if I have anything else published, I would appreciate it if it was published as it was written." The interview then delves into Theis's view on OSFAN and another local fandom, which we'll skip over. OSFAN then asks, "Is there anything else in the Eye of Argon that you would have changed now that you have reread it in OSFAN 10? And Theis says, "In fact, I have changed it. I went over it for an independent study for English in school. You know, like adjectives changed and places where sentences should be deleted, things of this type. Even so, it is nothing to be proud of, and yet it is. Because how many people have had their first story published at one, even if it is in a fanzine or clubzine? How many professional writers have written a complete story at so early an age? Even so, Eye of Argon isn't great. I basically don't know much about structure or composition." OSFAN then asks, "Are you now working on structure, composition, and grammar?" Theis says, "Yes, I am, but it is difficult because I'm still in high school and must work on my writing in spare time. Basically, these books on English composition haven't taught me anything I didn't know, but they are showing me how to put them, composition, grammar, ECT, into a working order." OSFAN, "Whenever can OSFAN expect another contribution from YU?" Theis, "Whenever they want one. In fact, you've got my latest story at your place. Have you read it?" OSFAN responds by saying, "I started it, but I haven't had the time to finish it. What inspired you to write it?" I have to kind of cut in here. That is such bullshit. I've heard that so many times, and I've done it before, and nobody ever has actually read or looked at the thing that you're talking about if what they say is, "I started it, but I haven't the time to finish it." Anyway, Theis then says, "The idea for the story came to me while watching Alfred Hitchcock reruns. Incidentally, my story has nothing to do with what was on television." OSFAN then responds, "I am personally proud of your story for OSFAN 10 in the sense that it is more than I could have done. Also, the fact when they were kidding you about it, you took it so well. I think YU should be given a pat on the back for such good sportsmanship. You showed real character." Theis then says, "I didn't know that. I mean, it was easier than showing bad character and inviting trouble." As you can likely tell, the editing and the typewriting here is rough. OSFAN 10 and OSFAN 13 were released only about 3 months apart, and similar issues can be found in both. With what Theis said about the editing, and the consistent outcropping of errors in both 10 and 13, and almost all of OSFAN editions I've now read, I find it fair to conclude that not all of the errors are Theis's fault. People seem to believe that one of Theis's many flaws as a writer was his propensity to manufacture words. but I'm not convinced that every example of a bizarre linguistic insertion came out of Theis's brain alone. Yes, the composition of his story is weak, even he admitted as such, and I'm certain that he has made some spelling errors here and there, but there's more to art than what meets the eye. There's a story behind the story. See, Jim Theis is dead. He passed away on the 26th of March 2002 at the age of 48. From what I've managed to dig up, he passed away as a result of heart complications, though I have no way of verifying that. If there is a tragedy here, and maybe there is, it's that Theis doesn't have just one story. He hasn't done just the Eye of Argon. He has countless, and almost none of them are told. Not in writing, but in living. When we're reading a book, or looking at a painting, what we're seeing isn't just the mechanical creation of art. It's the soul and story of an artist bent forth into whatever shape their world aids in molding. The Eye of Argon is so much more than this piece of literature that will forever go down as the apotheosis of bad writing. It's the story of a small publication with poor composition in a small magazine with poor editing out in St. Louis, Missouri during the 1970s, written by a kid who was studying writing even though school made it hard, who would later on go on to say that the mockery he received over the Eye of Argon made him never want to write again. I was in high school when I first heard about the Eye of Argon, and I remember thinking to myself, man, this sucks. Well, that was after I had my fair share of laughing at it, admittedly. I knew I had wanted to write then, but I didn't have the courage nor the dedication or focus to do so. Hearing about Jim Theis, this guy who wrote and published something, just get absolutely lampooned over it was discouraging, to say the least. The lesson here is twofold. 1. Practice compassionate critique. I see too many people on this platform and beyond who critique for clicks and views with no care for the author or the art. When you critique, and you should be doing so, face a work not with how can I best beat this thing down or prove myself better than it, but instead, how can I come out of this encounter a better person or artist while offering something to the thing I'm facing. That alone isn't enough though. However, for we need to be more attentive to the stories behind narratives. Read not just the first thing presented to you, but look past it, behind it, into the meta-narrative that has constructed it. Then critique. Compassionate criticism is about affordance, integrity, and understanding. While there's nothing wrong with criticizing something from a modern perspective, we do need to in order to move forward in art. We also have to strike a balance against modern assumptions with context provided by the past. Dive into a work as best as you can. Sure, look at it from the outside and inspect it, but then look at it from the inside out too. The other lesson here is this: don't give up. It is an unfortunate reality that Theis did, though I doubt many of us could take what he had to and move on from it. Read the Eye of Argon with a compassionate mindset, a compassionate curiosity, however, and you'll find that it has potential. With a good editor and another 10 or 20 years under his belt, Theis could have become a really special author who meant something to somebody. Anybody really can be that for somebody else, a life changer. You don't have to be the next Dostoevsky to make a difference in literature or beyond. To end this before I become too cheesy and trite, and I fear that I already have, let your passions flourish. Thanks for listening.